How I got revenge on my cheating ex. It's been almost 12 years since everything happened. I'm doing my best to remember all the details because my life was crazy back then. I have this bad habit of picking guys who are not good for me. My friends would always say, "Girl, you need to get your head together." I laughed it off because, well, it's just who I am, I guess. But one of my worst choices was a guy named Bob, not his real name, of course. I met Bob while working at the mall, where I was trying to make ends meet. We started dating, and soon we moved in together. Looking back, it was a really bad idea, but I was dumb and lonely. I guess I just wanted to feel like I belonged. Bob had some crazy ideas. He'd say things that weren't true, like there are only 4 continents, and the others are owned by aliens. It sounded like something you'd read in a science fiction novel. When I'd argue with him, he'd keep going in circles until I agreed or just gave up. It was like he'd built up these walls and refused to listen to reason. He also made up unbelievable stories, like when I asked where he'd been living before he moved in with his mom, he said he'd been camping in the woods. I was like, "What? You mean you were actually living in a tent?" I just couldn't wrap my head around it. When I asked how he did that for months without any gear, he just pointed at himself and said, "This is all the gear I need." Like he was some kind of survival expert. I was starting to think he might actually be crazy. The worst thing about Bob was his laziness. He was unemployed for most of our relationship. He just sat around watching movies or playing games on my computer. He'd be up all hours of the night, his fingers flying across the keyboard, ignoring my attempts to start a conversation. I thought, you know what, Bob? I'm not your mother. He never cleaned up after himself, leaving dirty dishes everywhere and making my apartment smell awful. It was like a pigsty. I would ask him about finding a job, but he would make excuses like, "I don't have a car," or "the bus doesn't go there." I worked double shifts to make ends meet, and I even drove him all over town to get job applications and fill them out. Sometimes he wouldn't even bother with the applications and we'd have to start over. Since he didn't have a phone, all the applications had my information on them. I let him use my phone to make calls or set up interviews while I was at work. I was practically doing his job for him. Things started getting strange. Bob stayed up late chatting with his friends, sometimes until dawn. We'd hang out for hours, but then he'd make an excuse to check his game before bed. He'd pull out his headphones, and his world would vanish. Hours would pass and there was still no Bob. I started feeling suspicious, but there was nothing obvious happening, so I thought I was just being insecure. I really didn't want to admit that he might be hiding something. Then, he started asking to use my car to see his best friend, Ben. I was hesitant, but I knew Ben pretty well. We were close friends, even though Ben and Bob were just acquaintances. I trusted Ben more than Bob, which probably should have been a clue about what was going on. But I was still pretty naive back then. I let him borrow my car a few times while I was working. He always came back on time with the car and my phone, so I didn't think anything was wrong. One day, he asked to borrow my car to go to a card tournament with his friends. He was pretty convincing, and it was all about winning big money, even going so far as to show me his fancy cards. He claimed he had a great deck of cards and would win enough money to buy himself a phone. He kept saying, "This time will be different. Trust me." I was tired and didn't want to spend my day off at the tournament. Honestly, I don't even know what they played. Something called a card game. Whatever. So I agreed. I stayed home, drank a few beers, and fell asleep. I woke up feeling sick. I felt awful. My stomach was churning, and I was throwing up everything I had eaten. My entire body felt weak and wobbly. I was sweating, shivering, and could barely move. I was alone, without a car or my phone. I thought, why did I let him take my car? And where did he go with my phone? Why am I all alone and feel so sick? I was so lost and scared. It felt like everything had just spun out of control. Eventually, I was able to crawl to my bedroom and put on a robe. Then I went down the stairs of my building and knocked on the doors of my neighbors. It took me 3 apartments before someone answered. I called my mom, and she was at my apartment in minutes. She rushed me to the emergency room, and they said I had C. diff, a really bad bacterial infection. They said it was probably something I picked up from my bathroom, but I don't know how. Maybe that's why I felt so weird the entire time. I didn't really know how it worked back then. The doctors explained that the infection was a result of too much exposure to antibiotics, and that was probably why my immune system was so low. Bob finally showed up a few hours later with my phone and car keys. He looked worried, saying, "Oh my gosh, I am so sorry. Is there anything I can do?" I'm not sure I even believed him. My mom, however, hated him from then on. She would always say, "That boy. What in the world were you thinking?" My mom took care of me and brought me all kinds of chicken soup. My mom really knew what she was doing. I was back at work a few days later, but I knew our relationship was over. There was just too much hurt. The trust was broken. We were always struggling financially because Bob didn't have a job. He was always spending money and wasn't saving any. We never had a plan or even a decent conversation about our finances. Bob was a walking financial black hole. He just couldn't control himself. I got him a job delivering furniture for a company near my work. I knew some of the people there, and I was able to use my connections to get him the job. I thought, maybe this will help him get his act together. I was so hopeful. A few weeks later, I came home from work and saw a brand new TV and stereo system. Bob was grinning like an idiot. He looked so proud of himself. I told him we couldn't afford it and that we were barely eating. We had been making do with barely anything in the pantry, which made it all the more difficult. I felt a mix of sadness and anger. I told him, "You know, maybe if we saved a few bucks and paid off some bills, we wouldn't have to worry about living on crackers." He just shrugged and gave me that cocky smile. He told me about a great employee discount and said the payments would come out of his paycheck. I was furious. He hadn't even asked me before buying it, and he had put me on the account. He was practically using my credit to finance his purchases. If he didn't pay, I'd be stuck with the bill. I knew I had to take a stand, and I wasn't going to let him get away with this. A few more weeks passed, and our rent was late. We were getting eviction notices. We had barely enough to pay our rent and couldn't seem to stay ahead of the bills. I felt like our life was falling apart around us. I came home from work and noticed the TV was gone. I thought, good, he finally realized we couldn't afford it and took it back. Maybe he finally got it. We finally caught a break. He got paid, we paid the rent, and things seemed normal again. Or maybe it was just a brief moment of calm before the storm. Then I found a pawn ticket for the TV in Bob's pocket when I was doing laundry. I yelled, "What did you do?" "Why?" I felt like I was losing my mind. He assured me that he was going to get the TV back and that no one would ever know. I was furious, but also scared of what he might do. I was really starting to see just how manipulative and dangerous he could be. This wasn't the same person I met at the mall. We were both working, sharing a phone and a car, trying to make things work. It felt like our lives were constantly on the verge of falling apart. We were drowning in debt, and he seemed so unconcerned about it all. I was losing weight and getting sick more and more because of the stress. But it all fell apart on one fateful day. I woke up with a headache and let Bob take the car but asked him to leave me the phone. I needed to talk to my friend Lisa and see if she could maybe pick me up later. A few hours later, my phone rang. "Hello?" I said, still half asleep. There was a long pause before a woman's voice asked, "Is Bob there?" I felt sick to my stomach. This couldn't be real. "No, he's at work." "This is his wife," I said. I didn't know why, but that was the first thing that came out of my mouth. It wasn't true, but I was too shocked to think straight. She stammered and said she might have the wrong number. I could tell she wanted to get off the phone. But I desperately needed to hear the truth. I was just dying to know. "Please," I said. "I don't know what's going on, but I need someone to tell me the truth." She said, "Listen, I need to make a few calls, but I promise I'll call you back." She spoke so calmly and confidently that I wanted to believe her. "You promise?" I said. "I promise," she replied. "Okay. I'll talk to you soon," I said and hung up. I paced around the living room, staring at my phone, chain-smoking and talking to myself. I knew who she was calling. I tried to remember all the strange things Bob had been doing in the last few months. I had dismissed my feelings, blaming my bad intuition. But I started putting the pieces together. All those nights Bob had been online, he'd been talking to her. I started replaying the memories in my head, searching for clues, connecting the dots. All those times he'd said he was hanging out with Ben, he'd been taking this woman out in my car. I thought, this can't be true. The night I got sick and was all alone, he'd been with June. The sickening feeling in my stomach returned, a feeling of utter betrayal and heartbreak. Then, my phone rang again. It was her. I couldn't believe she'd actually called me back. I was terrified. I picked up the phone, and the next 45 minutes were the most painful of my life. The woman introduced herself as June. We shared our stories, and it quickly became clear what was happening. Bob had been dating June before we met. They'd gotten back in touch online and started flirting. I felt like a complete fool. Why hadn't I noticed? I just kept blaming myself and my insecurities. "Do you have a little silver hummingbird necklace?" she asked. "Yes. My mother gave it to me for my birthday," I said. "Really?" June said. "Because he gave me one for Mother's Day." I yelled, "OMG," and ran to my bedroom to check my jewelry box. The hummingbird necklace was gone. I had noticed that the necklace had disappeared a few months before, but I couldn't figure out what had happened to it. It was probably because I wasn't paying close enough attention. I felt like a complete and utter fool. I was furious. Bob had given it to June. June told me that Bob had taken me things to give to her as gifts. He'd even had June over to my apartment and told her it was his own. I couldn't believe he'd do such a cruel and disrespectful thing after I'd let him live with me for years. I'd let him use my car, my phone, and practically my entire life. I couldn't believe this was happening to me. How could he be so callous and cruel? June described my apartment, down to my bedsheets, proving that Bob had been lying. I could barely keep it together. June said, "You know what we should do? We should bust him together." I had to think fast. I felt a rush of adrenaline and rage. I couldn't let him get away with this. I agreed with June. We had to get him. We planned to meet at my work and lure Bob there. June lived 40 minutes away, and I only lived 6 miles from work. I was worried that she wouldn't get there in time. I called a coworker who was a friend and begged him for a ride. He covered for me at work and drove me to my car. When I arrived at Bob's work, I went inside to get my keys. I figured his boss wouldn't mind if I went to get them because he knew I was the owner of the car. But Bob's boss stopped me and wanted to talk about the money we owed for the TV. I didn't remember everything I said, but I told him we couldn't afford the TV and that Bob had pawned it. I was crying. I could barely control myself. His boss was furious. Apparently, it was illegal to pawn a rented item. He told me if I could get the TV back, he would let me cancel my contract without any penalties. I thanked him and said I would let Bob know that I was at work. My heart was racing. What was I going to say to Bob? Would June arrive before Bob did? I saw Bob coming towards me and scanned the parking lot for June's car. She wasn't there. Bob looked guilty. He stood there silently as I walked outside to light a cigarette. I just needed a moment. He started making excuses. "It's not what it seems. It's all a misunderstanding." I let him keep talking. I pretended to listen, waiting for June to arrive. Finally, I saw June's car pull into the parking lot. She got out and walked over to Bob. "Hey Bob. How are you?" she asked. Bob turned white. He hung his head and sat on the curb. June and I greeted each other awkwardly, then turned our attention back to Bob. He didn't even look at me. He looked as if he might be sick to his stomach. June started yelling at Bob about all his lies and deceit. She told us about all the things Bob had done, and how he'd been using both of us. It was humiliating to be caught in such a web of lies, but it was also oddly freeing. I could barely hold back my own tears. It was a very strange feeling. Anger, relief, humiliation, and sadness all mixed together. I was mostly silent, just agreeing with June, still trying to process everything that was happening. I just couldn't believe this was really my life. After about 20 minutes, I finally spoke. "We're done. I never want to see you again. I'll pack up your stuff and your sister can pick it up in a few days. I want my key back." "Not until I get my stuff," he said. He didn't meet my eyes. I tried to argue, but he was too big for me. He walked back towards his work. I wanted to scream and shout and kick his sorry butt, but he knew he had the advantage. June and I talked for a few minutes, then she gave me back my hummingbird necklace and left. She gave me a quick hug. "I'm so sorry, sweetie," she whispered. I stood there alone, trying to understand what had just happened. I cried. I cried for hours. I just couldn't believe that Bob could be so mean and selfish. My only option was to call my mom. As soon as she answered, I started telling her everything, sobbing and ranting. "Stay right there. I'm coming," my mom said. She was my rock. She'd always be there for me. My parents arrived in my dad's truck. My mom came out to hug me, but my dad looked furious. He clenched his jaw, gripped the steering wheel, and stared straight ahead. My parents drove me to the pawn shop and paid over $500 to get the TV back. Then, we went back to Bob's workplace and returned the TV to the manager. While the manager was finishing the paperwork, my dad saw Bob pacing around the parking lot, talking on the phone. He didn't hear what Bob was saying, but he came back a few minutes later, holding my house key. "I believe this is yours," he said. He hugged me, and I cried into his shoulder. It felt so good to let it all out. "They're firing him," my dad said. He kissed me on my forehead and whispered, "Now he's jobless and homeless." He always had this way of making me feel better. "Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that," I said, trying to sound sarcastic. We all laughed, and then my parents gave me some advice and drove away. They reminded me how strong I was. My best friend was waiting for me at home. She made me a cup of hot chocolate and kept me company while I just cried and cried. A few days later, Bob and his sister showed up to get his things. He tried to talk to me, to explain what happened, but my friend yelled at him to stop. I wasn't even going to hear his explanations. I didn't need his apologies or excuses. Bob left that night, and I never heard from him again. He didn't even try to contact me. I blocked him on social media, but he never seemed to make an effort to get in touch. He was always lazy, deluded, and in a hole. It's hard to believe that I had actually let him live in my apartment for so long. I'm happily married to my high school sweetheart now, and I have 2 little boys. They are the best things to ever happen to me. I'm so grateful that I moved on when I did. Bob hurt me, but I've learned from that experience and I've grown as a person. I'm not naive anymore, and I trust my gut instinct. I'm happy with my life now. But sometimes, when I'm drifting off to sleep, I wonder whatever happened to Bob. I hope he's okay, living in the woods, waiting for aliens to invade. Maybe he's trying to survive on a diet of only berries. He can dream, can't I? Thanks for reading.